be right back with Jonathan McLatchie as we focus on Islam on this Thoroughly Jewish Thursday.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown, your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
Welcome, friends, to Thoroughly Jewish Thursday. Michael Brown, thanks for joining us today. I've had some great interaction with Jonathan McLatchie. He's been on The Line of Fire previously. I joined him on an apologetics broadcast he does from England and talked about Messianic prophecy. Ended up having some interesting interaction with a Muslim apologist. Jonathan is a Christian writer, international speaker, and debater, holds a bachelor's degree with honors in forensic biology, a master's degree in evolutionary biology, and a second master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience. Currently, Jonathan is a PhD student in cell biology. I can guarantee you in the very first class that Jonathan had in college, his very first class in forensic biology, he already knew more biology than I know today. No, I can guarantee you that. Hey, Jonathan, welcome back to The Line of Fire.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Brown, for having me.
So someone with an academic focus like this and PhD student in cell biology, I mean, obviously a very, very specific focus in your work. How do you end up dealing with issues like Islam?
Well, that's a great question. As I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, I began to interact more so than before with people of the Muslim faith, as well as people of other religious traditions and worldview persuasions, and began to attend the various they called it the Islamic Awareness Week back then. They tend to call it the Discover Islam Week, but it's basically every university campus in the UK pretty much has an annual week of Islamic awareness, or as they call it, the Discover Islam Week, where they basically try to promote the Islamic religion and try to clarify stereotypes about Islam and Muslims. And so I've made a habit of attending those at the various universities I've attended. I've attended 3 universities to date, and just getting into interactions with Muslims and encountering the common objections that they have to the Christian faith, as well as the common polemics that they put out in favor of the Muslim worldview, such as, the prophecies about Muhammad in the Bible, or the fact that, no one's produced anything like the literary quality of the Quran, and so this testifies to its divine origin, or the numerous scientific miracles in the Quran, or and so forth, that Muslims use to support their Islamic view. And of course, they make challenges to the Christian faith as well, such as questioning the doctrine of the Trinity and questioning the deity of Christ and the fact that Jesus was crucified and the reliability of Scripture and so on. And so I became convicted that, this is something that we need to really engage with, because obviously Islam is something which is a religion which is growing in number of followers, adherents, and also growing in influence in the world. And so I have I've sought to become acquainted with the Muslim sources and the common Islamic polemics and apologetics, and I've participated in various debates with Muslims over the years, and my interest has grown since getting acquainted with that during my university years.
All right, so Jonathan, in your view, what would be the weakest arguments that the Islamic apologists bring, and what would be their strongest arguments?
Their weakest argument, there's so many weak arguments. It's hard to pick one.
I understand.
I mean, you probably, I know you've encountered through the webinar that you participated in the polemic that Muhammad has found in the Bible, which has got to be probably their weakest argument. Unfortunately, for Muslims, they are actually forced to adopt that position, because the Quran in Surah 7, verse 157, tells us that Muhammad is actually found in the pages of the Bible, and the Christians can read about Muhammad prophesied in the Bible. And so that's a real challenge, because it really commits you to finding him somewhere. What the text of the Quran says is that those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and the gospel, who enjoins upon them what is right and forbids them what is wrong, and makes lawful for them the good things and prohibits them the evil, and relieves them of their burden and the shackles which were upon them, and so on. But it says that they find the unlettered prophet written in what they have of the Torah and the gospel. And so Christians and Jews should be able to look back at the Torah and indeed the Injil, that is the gospel, and find Muhammad. And so Muslims have searched high and low. They've had 14 centuries to find Muhammad in the Bible, and unfortunately for them, they have not found anything which is even remotely resembling Muhammad in the Bible. One common popular example that they like to give is in John 14.
Right.
And they're kind of forced to use this text and indeed abuse this text, because it is the only example in the Gospels where Jesus actually predicts someone to come after him. And so if Muhammad is in the Gospel, it has to be this one, really. And what the text says in John 14, we read verse 15 following, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you."
Right.
And the Muslim argument is that this is speaking about Muhammad, and it doesn't refer to the Holy Spirit, which is the traditional Christian interpretation, which seems to be the natural interpretation of this passage. The problem with and they argue that the word parakletos is actually a corruption of paraklutos, and really it refers to the exalted one, which is Muhammad, rather than to the helper or the comforter. The problem with that argument, of course, is that the audience to whom Jesus was communicating is the disciples. And so he says that he dwells with you, namely the disciples, not people living in Arabia 6 centuries later, and he will be in you. That doesn't make any sense unless it's referring to a spirit rather than a human being, such as Muhammad. So that's a problem. And also Jesus, according to John 14 says that he asks the Father and he sends another helper. And then we read in John 16 that in verse 7, "Nevertheless, I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you." So here's another problem. If we're equating the Paraclete with Muhammad, and according to Islam, Muhammad is sent by Allah, but according to John's Gospel, the Paraclete is sent by Jesus. Who does that make Jesus? That makes him Allah, right? So it's a self-referentially refuting claim, because if you actually use this text consistently, then you end up with Jesus being God, because Jesus identifies himself as the one who sends the helper. So that's a problem with that. And just very briefly, one of the other popular passages that Muslims like to use is Deuteronomy 18, which is one of the classic ones from the Old Testament. We read about the prophets like unto Moses that God was to raise up. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers, to him you shall listen." And Muslims argue this is referring to Muhammad, and brothers, of course, refers to Ishmaelites, because Ishmael was the brother of Isaac. The problem is that brothers is actually defined in the same passage just a little bit earlier. If you read verse 1 of Deuteronomy 18, "Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's food offerings as their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers." And brothers there clearly refers to fellow kinsmen, fellow Israelites, rather than Ishmaelites.
Yep.
And finally, just to put the nail in the coffin for this one, Muslims typically try to argue that John 1 lends support to their interpretation, because in John 1, the Jews approach John the Baptist and they inquire as to his identity. They say, "Who are you?" He confessed, this is verse 20 of John 1, "He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." And so the Muslim apologist argues, well, clearly the Jews actually distinguish between the Christ and the prophet, and so they're not the same individual. The problem is, why on earth are the Jews asking John the Baptist, a fellow Jew, as to whether he is the prophet? Because obviously, for the Muslim argument to work, he has to be an Ishmaelite. And the Muslim will come back and say, well, they were mistaken about this. They made a mistake. Well, then why can't I understand that the Jews made a mistake about distinguishing between the Christ and the prophet? So you can't have your cake and eat it at that point.
Yeah, in fact, I don't want to mention the gentleman's name because he's not here to defend himself, but one Muslim apologist began to interact in the webinar and raise questions about Isaiah 42, trying to point to Muhammad. And I agreed to debate him on it, but I said, really, I think you may want to take a different subject because it's really not a fair debate. And we've agreed to do one. There's another Muslim I agreed to debate as well on similar issues. But he said, okay, we debate Isaiah 42 and we debate Deuteronomy 18. I thought, why in the world would you want to debate these? You know, it'd almost be like me, you've got your British heavyweight champion now, Anthony Joshua, then I'm going to challenge him to a boxing match. I mean, why? Take something where you got a little bit of shot at it. All right, we'll be right back with Jonathan McLatchie.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the line of fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
It is Thoroughly Jewish Thursday. This is Michael Brown with my guest, Christian apologist Jonathan McLatchie. Jonathan, I've debated rabbis, counter-missionaries over the years about God's triunity and the deity of Yeshua, deity of Jesus. And in doing so, what I can do is rely on the Hebrew Bible and draw my arguments from there and say, hey, we can limit it entirely to the Hebrew Scriptures. And I can also draw on rabbinic tradition to build a bridge to some of the concepts. Obviously, debating a Muslim on it would be very different because they wouldn't be accepting the authority of the Hebrew Scriptures as we have them. And, of course, rabbinic literature would be of no use. So when you're debating something like that, that to me would be a more challenging one than debating Muhammad in the Old Testament, simply because we don't have as much common ground. And they can just say, well, the Trinity is confusing or something like that. So what do you feel is the best approach when debating these issues, the Trinity, deity of Jesus, with a Muslim?
Well, one might want to highlight the Quranic representations, or rather misrepresentations, of the doctrine of the Trinity. For example, Surah 4, verse 171 in the Quran says, do not say three, stop it, that is good for you. Allah is the only one God. He is far too pure to have a son. And so obviously, it says do not say three there. It doesn't say do not say Trinity, which is what some translations, such as the Yusuf Ali translation, render it. But if you say don't say three because there's only one, what are you doing? You're putting the two in the same category. And obviously, we as biblical Trinitarian monotheists do not believe that we do not think that there are three gods. We believe that there's one divine being and three divine persons. And so the Quran actually misrepresents the doctrine of the Trinity at that particular point. Surah 6, verse 101, moreover, says, he is the originator of the heavens and the earth. How can he have a son when he never had a wife? He created everything and he knows everything. Now, obviously, as Christians, we don't believe that Allah has taken to himself a wife and begotten his son Jesus. That's not the Christian belief, but that's what the Quran represents us as saying. Or Surah 573. Surely disbelievers are those who say Allah is the third of three, while there is no God but one God. Obviously, again, it's equating the doctrine of the Trinity with tritheism, which is not what the doctrines have ever maintained. And verse 75 of that same chapter says, the Messiah, son of Miriam, is no more than a messenger. There be messengers before him. His mother was very truthful. Both of them used to eat food. Look how we explain signs to them and see how far they are turned away. And then that obviously raises the question, why would it say that Mary would eat food? Surely that should be obvious. And you continue reading into the context, and you get to verse 116, when it says, And when Allah said, O Isa, that's Jesus, son of Miriam, did you say to the people, take me and my mother as gods beside Allah? He said, pure are you. It does not behoove me to say what is not right for me. Had I said it, you would have known it. You know what is in my heart, and I do not know what is in yours. You alone have full knowledge of all that is unseen. And so it seems to me that the Quran seems to have this confused notion of the Christian concept of the Trinity, which equates it with Allah, Jesus, and Mary. This actually, although it doesn't explicitly, expressly equate the Trinity with Allah, Jesus, and Mary, that particular verse actually led the earliest biographer of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq, in his Sirah Zo'Allah in the mid-8th century, to equate the Trinity explicitly with Allah, Jesus, and Mary. Speaking of the Christians, he said, they argue that it is the third of three in that God says, we have done, we have commanded, we have created, and we have decreed. And they say, if he were one, he would have said, I have done, I have created, and so on. But he is he and Jesus and Mary. Concerning all these assertions, the Quran came down. And so that seems to give us an insight into how the early Muslims understood the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. You can also look at...
So that, in other words, just to make sure our listeners have this, that their perception, based on misunderstanding of Christian doctrine and perhaps some of the iconography of the Catholics or others they would have run into, was that the Trinity was Father, Son, and Mary. That's basically how they conceived it, and that's what they were combating in the Quran.
Exactly. You've also got the concept of Tawheed in Islam is interesting, because typically in a Tawheed versus Trinity debate, in which I participated in several such debates with Muslims, and typically the Muslim will come equipped and prepared to talk about the doctrine of the Trinity and highlight apparent problems with the Trinity, whereas they rarely come prepared and equipped to defend the Islamic concept of Tawheed. And in fact, there are numerous problems that abound for the concept of Tawheed. One philosophical problem is, of course, that love is an essential quality of God, right? God is essentially loving, but he's not essentially creating. It's possible that God might not create, he might freely choose not to create, but he is essentially loving. And so then that obviously raises the question as to who was the object of God's love before creation. Obviously, the doctrine of Tawheed would maintain that God is not dependent upon his creation. And Muslims will typically respond and say, well, surely mercy is an essential quality as well. Is God being merciful to the other members of the Trinity? Whereas I would argue that mercy is actually an expression of love rather than the essential quality, just as wrath is an expression of righteousness rather than the essential quality itself. Moreover, Richard Swinburne, a Christian philosopher, has argued that if God is the greatest conceivable being, as St. Anselm told us, and if there's a unique best action, God must do that action. If there's a unique best quality or kind of action, God must do an action of that quality or kind. Introducing a third divine person introduces a new quality of goodness, namely cooperation and sharing that goodness with another, whereas introducing a fourth divine person introduces a new fundamental quality of goodness. And so 3 is the best number for maximizing divine greatness, because a fourth person would be superfluous and God would no longer be a necessary being. There's also Quranic challenges to Tawheed. I mean, the Quran actually never affirms Unitarianism. It affirms monotheism, but it never actually affirms Unitarianism. Now, there's the doctrine of the Quran says that we cannot ascribe partners to Allah. That would be to commit the doctrine of shirk. Yet the Quran also teaches us, it seems to contradict this on occasion. For example, there's the doctrine of the divine spirit in Islam. So Allah is the creator of life. He's the sole creator of life. For example, Surah 15:23 tells us it is we, this is Allah, and only we who gives life and brings death, and we are the ultimate inheritor. We read that Allah creates life by a certain mechanism, namely breathing His spirit. And Surah 21:91, for example, remember her who protected her private parts. We blew in her through our spirit and made her and her sign a sign for all the worlds. Or Surah 66:12 says the same thing, that Allah creates Jesus by breathing of His spirit. We read in Surah 19, Surah Miriam, named after the Virgin Mary, that the Holy Spirit actually took upon Himself the form of a perfect human being and announced that He was going to bestow upon her a boy. And so this creates a problem, because you have Allah creating by breathing His spirit, and the spirit turns out to be a personal agent who actually speaks to Mary and actually announces that He is going to bestow upon her a boy, using the Arabic word wahaba, which means to grant, to bestow, to present, etc.
Tell you what, I've got to jump in here. This is fascinating stuff, and for many listening, brand new information. I'm going to ask Jonathan to stay over with us into this next half hour and give us some practical guidelines on sharing the gospel with Muslims. We'll be right back.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, activist, author, international speaker, and theologian, Dr. Michael Brown. Your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Get into The Line of Fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
I have a special guest with me on this Thoroughly Jewish Thursday, Christian apologist Jonathan McLatchie, who's engaged in many debates, dialogues with Muslims in England. Jonathan, great to have you today on The Line of Fire.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Let me ask you a quick question. We did a webinar a few weeks back for me Saturday afternoon, for you Saturday night, where I talked for a while on Messianic prophecy and then fielded questions. And it ended up that an Islamic apologist joined in and raised questions, and we interacted further. What kind of feedback have you gotten to that? This is a neat thing you do with different apologists, and folks from different backgrounds can join in, ask their questions. What kind of feedback did you get to that event?
Yeah, people very much enjoyed your webinar. Actually, I heard a number of people say that it was the best webinar actually we had so far, and I know Dr. James White commented on it on his Dividing Line program, and it was certainly a very good presentation, and we very much appreciated having you on and the interaction that you had with us. We call it the Apologetics Academy, and basically we bring on different scholars and apologists and personalities each Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, which is 3 p.m. Eastern, and we have them basically present on a topic of interest to Christians, particularly on topics pertinent to questions such as, is Christianity actually true? And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews. And I don't just bring on Christian scholars, I also often bring on atheists or sometimes even Muslim scholars, and we have them present their arguments, give a short opening presentation, and then we field questions from the floor. And so it gives opportunity for Christians to practice their debate if we're talking to a non-Christian skeptic, or and so we simulate a real life situation, or alternatively, we can have Christians we can give Christians access to a scholar or apologist that they don't otherwise have access to, and they can get their questions addressed, and they can have one-on-one interaction with them, and then we can move on to someone else. And so it really allows us to unpack different issues in a lot of depth.
Yeah, and we posted the video, which again was an online a substitute of Skype kind of thing. We posted on our YouTube channel, Ask Dr. Brown, AskDr Brown, the entire, whatever it was, 2.5 hours or more of material we posted. Jonathan, if folks want to find out about this or potentially get involved, where do they go?
If you go to my website, which is apologetics-academy.org, and click on Online Apologetics Training, or if you go to apologetics-academy.org/online-training, that will take you to the upcoming schedule for the speakers that we have. This coming Saturday, we have Dr. Lydia McGrew coming on, and Lydia McGrew is going to talk to us about undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. So we're looking forward to having her on.
All right. We've got 1 minute to answer this, and then I want to ask you some questions about practical tips for sharing the gospel with Muslims. But 1 minute or less, are you ever afraid that bringing skeptics on, bringing non-believers on, will raise doubts and questions, or are you confident that we have the truth to answer these?
I'm confident that we have the truth to answer these. I mean, I operate with the philosophy that if Christianity is true, then we don't have anything to fear from honest inquiry and critical scrutiny. So I brought on, for example, in the past, atheist David Fitzgerald, who's a Jesus mythicist, and then we had him present to us on why he thinks Jesus never existed. And then in the audience, we had some really top scholars, like Dr. Timothy McGrew, for example, was there, and others. And we had some really great interaction, and I think that we really demonstrated through that webinar just how difficult it is to actually defend the Jesus mythicist position, because I thought that Fitzgerald was really on the back foot throughout that webinar. I've had Matt Dillahunty on in the past, I've had Aaron Ratt on, and other atheists. I've got Dr. Robert Price scheduled in the future.
Excellent. So, all right, friends, apologetics-academy.org. When you get there, just click on the online training. Or if it's .com, we'll get you the right site. We'll be right back.
Fire we want, for fire we please. Send the fire.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the line of fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
It is Thoroughly Jewish Thursday, and we often focus on the Middle East and Islam as well on a Thoroughly Jewish Thursday. This is something that I've looked at more in terms of Muslim outreach. We have grads from our ministry schools serving in Muslim nations, some places I can't even say where they are because of the dangerous situations in which they find themselves. It's been on our heart for many years to reach the Muslim world. I'm talking about going right in the heart of it. One of our fire missionaries serving in Nigeria with a children's school is constantly teaching Muslim children and sharing the love of Jesus with Muslim families in a region not far from Boko Haram. We've got courageous folks out there. At the same time, we continue to sound the alarm against radical Islam and urge America and the West to recognize the dangers. So it's both and for us. I'm speaking with Jonathan McLatchie. His website, apologetics-academy.org. And if you just scroll down on the page, you'll see online apologetics training. Click on that to find out about the Saturday seminars. Jonathan, before we get to some practical thoughts in terms of reaching Muslims with the gospel, and obviously the purpose of debate is not simply to defend our views, but to reach others, to get others to think practically. And I know you could go on at length, but we'll just get kind of soundbite answers. Now that you have a Muslim mayor of London, does that speak of radical changes in your country? Does that speak of Islam incrementally seeking to take over the nation, or is that an alarmist mentality?
I don't. I mean, obviously there are some Muslims who would like to do that, but I certainly don't think it's all Muslims or even most Muslims who are of that mentality. So certainly Islam is on the rise in the UK, that's for sure, and Islam is steadily increasing, and Islam is becoming more and more influential in the UK. There's Sharia law tribunals, for example, and Islam is certainly becoming more influential. Certainly, in the universities I've attended, the Islamic Society is often bigger than the Christian Union. So certainly Islam is becoming bigger and more influential. As to how that will manifest itself 5-10 years down the line, I think is difficult to say.
Yeah, well, what about this, though? Christians want to evangelize, share the gospel, make disciples of the nations. Islam does, but in a different way, in that Islam is calling for submission to Allah and the imposition of Sharia law. So wouldn't this be a logical strategy to take more and more and more ground, to implement Sharia within Islamic communities, and ultimately to get to some point where there's a majority or enough presence to impose it on the nation?
As I said, certainly some Muslims are of that mentality. For example, Anjem Chowdhury, who is a well-known London Muslim cleric, would like to do that, and he would like to impose and implement Sharia law upon the UK, and that's his agenda, and it's the agenda of other Muslims too. But I don't think that I would say that's but certainly with respect to the Muslims that I've encountered, I wouldn't say that's the majority mentality.
Got it. All right. I appreciate the fair answer. And then this is not Thoroughly Jewish Thursday subject matter, but since you're on the air, I've got to ask you, and again, just the soundbite answer, what's your personal feeling about Brexit?
My personal feeling is, it's a complex matter for sure, and there's certainly pros and cons on both sides. I personally would be pro-Remain, but I can see where both sides are coming from.
And do you think that there are major implications for the nation in the days ahead now that the decision has been made? For sure. It's difficult to know exactly how that is going to
unravel. Certainly, the economy took a major hit because of the uncertainty. That's an immediate consequence of the decision. But it's difficult to say at this point exactly. Certainly the UK is still part of the EU for another 2 years to come, so it's not immediately separated at this point.
Got it. All right, so back to, I appreciate the answers, and I really have so little insight on this whole issue, except for just having to wonder what's going to happen to the people that were basing their prophetic scenarios on a 10-nation European Union and allegedly finding prophecies of it in the book of Revelation. I kind of wonder what happens with that, but we shall see. All right, you're the average Muslim that we're going to speak to in America, or you're going to speak to in the UK, is not trying to blow you up, is not a terrorist going around with a machete looking for someone to behead. You have some Muslims who are more devoted than others, and some who are very sympathetic to Islamic terror. But let's just say you're a neighbor, friend, they identify as Muslim, they feel very strongly about being Muslims. They may not pray 5 times a day, but they probably fast during Ramadan and things like that. You want to share the gospel with them. What would you give as basic tips, either what to do or what not to do?
Sure. Well, I would want to communicate to them, the doctrine of human depravity. First of all, obviously in Islam, we're created basically good, whereas in Christianity, we're actually we have the doctrine of original sin, that we're all sinful by nature, and so we need to clarify that. We need to contrast it with God's holiness and look at the concept of justice in Islam, because justice obviously is an expression of God's holiness, His righteousness, and in Islam, God can basically turn a blind eye to sin. For example, there's a hadith narration in Sahih Bukhari which tells us about a man who'd murdered 99 men, and he's looking about asking how his repentance can be received and accepted. And he comes to a monk, and he asks the monk, and the monk says, "Sorry, you can't be forgiven." And so he murders the monk, and so now he's slaughtered 100 men. And so he's continuing asking, and someone eventually tells him to go to a certain village where his repentance can be accepted. But on the way, the time for his death comes, and so the good and bad angels come to argue over his soul, and Allah rules that if he's close to the town he was going to, then he'd be forgiven. And so Allah causes the earth to shrink, so he's 1 cubit closer to the city he was going to, and so he's forgiven. And so that's the concept of justice in Islam. There was no justice dispensed for the 100 men that this man had killed. Whereas in Christianity, by contrast, no sin is ever forgiven. It's the sinner that's forgiven. The sin is dealt with to the just degree, either on the head of the sinner or on the head of the sinless substitute, namely Jesus Christ. And so I would want to look at the concept of justice and how in Christianity alone do God's compassion, His love, His mercy come together and meet hand in hand with His justice and His integrity and His holiness. It's only in view of the cross of Christ that we can actually reconcile those doctrines, because God is the greatest conceivable being, and so God must manifest the attributes which are maximally great. And obviously love and justice are great-making qualities, and it's only in the cross of Christ that those qualities come together.
And when you speak to a Muslim, obviously you're conveying things in very eloquent terms and in theological terms as you're breaking them down for the person you're speaking with, and they have to deal with the fact of their own sinfulness. Do Muslims in general have a view of themselves as righteous, good people, or as people who sin and are in need of forgiveness?
Certainly there's a need for forgiveness concept in Islam, and Muslims consider themselves in need of forgiveness. Even Muhammad, according to the Quran, needed to repent. So Muhammad was certainly a sinner as well, even though a lot of Muslims have a view that Muhammad was sinless. That seems to contradict what the Quran tells us. Many Muslims will accept that they are sinful and in need of forgiveness. There's a concept in Islam of scales, and everyone's born with a set of scales, and there's a good and bad angel on your shoulders that are weighing up and taking note of your good and your bad deeds, and these are ultimately weighed against each other. And if you are more righteous than you are sinful, then you can be granted entry into Jannah or paradise. But obviously in Islam, there's actually no guarantee of salvation. Even Muhammad wasn't guaranteed salvation according to the Quran. And Abu Bakr, his closest companion, and indeed his father-in-law, father of Aisha, his child bride, Abu Bakr said, even if I had 1 foot in paradise, even then I would still fear Allah's deception, according to the Hadith narrations. And so there's no concept of eternal security, which is another beauty of Christianity, where I believe as a Christian that we do have eternal security. And so that's something I would communicate as well.
Yeah, and the whole idea of knowing that you can know that your sins are forgiven. I'll never forget a conversation I had, Jonathan, with a Muslim driver. It was just a driving service driving me to the airport. When I found it was a Muslim, we began to talk. And I asked him, is he devout? Yes. Does he do this? Does he do that? Just upholds the pillars of Islam. Yes, yes. I said, so you're sure when you die, you go to paradise? He said, 50-50. 50-50. Think of it. Think of living your whole life. And that's it. All right. Got one more segment with Jonathan McLatchie. His website, apologetics-academy.org.
Join Dr. Michael Brown along with Messianic Jewish pastor Scott Volk for a unique behind-the-scenes tour of Israel, February 25th through March 6, 2017. Space is limited, so we're accepting applications on a first-come, first-served basis. For more information on the trip and to secure your spot, please visit our website at AskDrBrown.org and click on the Israel Tour banner, or call our office at 704-782-3760.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown, your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
Welcome to Thoroughly Jewish Thursday. I do hope you can join me in Israel next year for the tour of a lifetime. Go to my website, Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. to find out more. All right, I've just got a few more minutes with Jonathan McLatchie. Thanks for staying on with us the better part of this hour. Allow me to switch subjects on you once more, because you have so much academic training in biology and cellular biology and things like that. Obviously, you've looked at works like Stephen Meyer's Signature of the Cell and other things like that. Even though it's Thoroughly Jewish Thursday, I want to deviate from our subject matter and ask you, in your academic study, what has been most awe-inspiring as you study biology, study cellular biology? What has most struck you in terms of arguments for the existence of an intelligent designer, of a creator, through your academic studies in science?
Well, that's a great question. There's so many examples to pick from. I mean, certainly the information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA, for me, is really compelling as an argument for design, because obviously there's a habitual association in our cause and effect experience between information content and conscious activity. And so when we find information intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, it follows that the most causally adequate explanation is that it arose by virtue of an intelligent agency, just as if we were looking at the hieroglyphic inscription or the pages of or the paragraphs in the pages of a book. We would infer design by virtue of the specified complexity that is conveyed there. And by specified complexity, of course, I mean a phenomenon or pattern which is complex, and by complex I mean improbable, so improbable that it exhausts the probabilistic resources at one's disposal, and it also is specified. So by specified I mean it conforms to some independently given pattern, just as, say, if you dial in a 4-digit PIN number to your ATM machine, that PIN number is a specified complexity because it's specific to your bank card. So it's not only improbable, but it's also specified. And that's what we find in DNA. And DNA, of course, does many things. It's involved in gene control and regulation, and also specifies the sequential ordering or arrangement of amino acid subunits that form proteins. And proteins are basically the toolkit of the cell, and there's different proteins that are crafted in different ways to perform different tasks in the cell. They might form parts of molecular machines, or they might form enzymes that participate in biochemical pathways. And the ratio or the prevalence of functional and stable protein structures within the vast array of combinatorial possibilities, arrays of arranging amino acids, seems to be astronomically small if you look at the scientific literature. And then when it comes to actually explaining macromolecular machines which require multiple such proteins to cooperate in concert, then the probabilities multiply exponentially. And that, to me, is a really powerful argument for design. When you look at the wonders of DNA replication machinery, or the wonders of, say, the bacterial flagellar motor, and the way that the bacterial flagellar motor is assembled within the cell, the way the sequential ordering of the expression of the different gene products as the flagellar motor is put together is absolutely mind-boggling. And it strains credulity to say that this could possibly be put together by some neo-Darwinian stochastic type of mechanism. So, yeah.
So, Jonathan, I presume that many of the professors under whom you've studied have been non-believers, and yet my reading of this as a non-scientist is that it does strain credulity to try to explain DNA, RNA any other way, or some of these other things you're getting into that the complexity is beyond me. It seems to strain credulity to explain these other ways. Did you ever have the opportunity, we've only got 2 minutes, but to ask any of these professors who were maybe agnostics or atheists if it didn't strain their own credulity to believe these things?
I tend to not be very confrontational in the university setting, because I don't like to present myself as a peer to a professor or supervisor in that way. But I mean, in my undergraduate, I did have a conversation with an immunologist I was studying under about the complement system, the complement cascade, which is a very complex and sophisticated mechanism involved in immunology. And I asked him whether this seemed to be the type of mechanism that could be constructed in a neo-Darwinian fashion, and he had no idea how it could have come together in that way.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah, well, Jonathan, I'm sure all of this learning you'll continue to marshal for the cause of the gospel. And obviously, it's the power of the Holy Spirit that opens a sinner's heart to the Lord. It's God's mercy that's poured in that turns them. And yet many times as we reason together, people are willing now to hear the rest of the messages. C.S. Lewis intellectually went from atheist to theist, and then by the Spirit was converted. So it's a both and even for Christians to help us love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, having our mind renewed to these truths is wonderful. And again, as a non-scientist, my impression is the more science learns, the harder it's going to be to deny God the Creator. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Romans 1:20 is far more true now than it was when Paul wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not just dealing with where did the thunder and lightning come from. You're dealing with where did this complex information come from. I remember talking to a Filipino doctor, a woman who did brain surgery. And I was talking to her about how much we understand about the brain. She said, oh, almost nothing. And I said, the more you get into it, do you see that it's complex? Or it turned out she was a Christian, and she's just in awe of God the more she studies the brain. So, Jonathan, thanks for using your brain for the glory of God and being a blessing to our listeners. Hopefully some of them will join you at the Apologetics Academy in the future. God bless you, dear brother.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
All right. So go to apologetics-academy.org, apologetics-academy.org. Check out the resources there, and then scroll down for online training. You can be part of the weekly webinar with top scholars, with non-believing scholars as well, interacting. You'll find it very, very fruitful. So again, appreciate the great work that Jonathan is doing. And be sure to visit our website. We are constantly adding new articles and new videos. As I was flying back from Australia, I wrote an article that's gone somewhat viral this week, and then wrote another article day after I got back, and then just wrote another article this morning. New videos we're putting out, all there on the website, plus our special resource offer at Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. My bottom line today, speak the truth with confidence to atheists, Muslims, believers, non-believers of every stripe. We're on the side of truth in Jesus.